Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining the Nosher tonight for our second Passover cooking class of 2023. I am delighted to introduce Sonya Sanford, who will be leading the show tonight and teaching us all how to prepare a vegetarian Passover meal from soup to dessert. And I, for one, cannot wait to learn. So I will turn it over to Sonya, and I will be sure to post all of the recipe links in the chat, and feel free to ask your questions in the chat too. Thank you so much, Sonya.
Hi, everyone. I'm just letting people come in. There was a little snafu with the links, so thank you, everyone. I'm glad you were able to find us and join us today, and we'll just give everyone an extra minute to come in. If you want to type in the chat where you're watching from, I love hearing where you all are from. I know some people I know are here and many people I don't. It's always so wonderful to come together. So yeah, let us know where you're from. Connecticut, New York, British Columbia. I love the Pacific Northwest, which is where I am. My cat wants to join the Zoom. Michigan. Wonderful. Knoxville, Tennessee. Hi from Portland. I'm in Portland as well, in Oregon. Okay. Well, let me tell you all a little bit about myself. I'm a writer and a chef. I've been writing for the Nosher for over 10 years now and sharing recipes. I specialize in modern Jewish food, Soviet and Ukrainian Jewish food, and seasonal Jewish cooking. And today we're going to be doing this. Oh, and also I host a podcast called Food Friends. You can find it on every platform with podcasts. And there I talk with my co-host about home cooking. You can follow me on Instagram at Sonya Michelle Sanford, or follow me on my website, sonyasanford.com. And if you subscribe to my newsletter, you'll always hear about these free classes that I'm doing, whether they're for the Nosher or any other classes, or if I'm doing a special class through my own site. So yeah, I love connecting with you. And let's start talking about vegetarian Passover cooking. I want to just preemptively say, every community has their own practices at Pesach. Everyone has their own kashrut, so there's going to be differences. So please advise with your own rabbi and your own community about what you can and cannot eat. I'm sharing things that I eat in my home at Passover, and so hopefully it will work for many of you. I will always try to tell you substitutions whenever I can, and unfortunately not everything has a substitution, so we'll talk about that too. If you're feeling really lost or have a question, drop it in the chat. We'll get to you. And also, Becky is going to share the recipes. So a few of these recipes are my personal ones, but there's also a recipe for the best ever vegetarian matzo ball soup that the Nosher has had for several years now. That's just incredible. And I'm going to be teaching that and also showing you my own riffs on it. Okay, but like all good things, we're going to start with dessert because why not? And I want it to bake while we're all together and we can take it out of the oven together. So this recipe, which Becky is going to link, is going to say a blueberry lemon snacking cake. It all takes place in one bowl. You don't need any special equipment, but instead of blueberries and lemons, I'm going to make this a strawberry cake. And what I love about this cake for Pesach or any time of year is it's completely grain-free. It's very simple to make. It doesn't require matzah meal or matzah cake meal, which I don't particularly love the flavor of. And it's very, very customizable. So you can do strawberries, blueberries, frozen berries, fresh berries. I would avoid fruits that are too watery, but anything in the berry family will work. So what I've done is I've whisked together right before our call, some sugar and some eggs together, and they've more than doubled in size. You can see they're quite like fluffy and silky, and it's really giving the volume that our cake is going to need because we're not using all the normal things and we're using almond meal instead of flour. So we want to give some height to this cake. And then I'm going to continue by gently adding in the wet ingredients, the other wet ingredients. I'm adding a little lemon juice. The acidity here is going to help more than the flavor. If you're wanting lemon flavor like the blueberry cake, then you'll also add the zest. And I'm going to add a little oil. I'm using just a sunflower oil. You can use avocado, you can use vegetable canola, whatever oil you have, olive oil, any oil that you can use at Passover is fine here. And then I'm going to add a splash of vanilla. I'm not going to measure it, but there are measurements listed. You could also use vanilla paste. You could leave this out if you don't have it. For the blueberry lemon version of this, I like to add a little almond extract. That's also totally optional, but for the strawberry one, I omit the almond. And then I'm just going to gently whisk that. I don't want to deflate all my eggs. So it's really like a 2-second whisk. Again, this is why I love this recipe so much. It's so simple. And then after we add our wet ingredients, we're going to add our dry ingredients, and we're going to add them all to the same bowl. You don't have to get a separate bowl out. So here I have some baking soda, baking powder, and salt. Again, if you don't use this at Pesach, it's a good recipe for another time when you need gluten-free recipes, but I do, so I'm adding those. And then I have super fine almond meal. You really want it to be super fine. You can find this particular one, which is kosher and Parv certified at Trader Joe's. I find that that's usually the most inexpensive place for almond meal. You can also find it at Costco. And if you really don't have access to it, you can take blanched almonds and blend them in a food processor. It's just they might not be quite as fine as, you know, getting it pre-made. This again is a super fine almond meal that usually comes in that form. And so this is 2 1/4
Sonia,
cups.
just a question came up about if it's okay to substitute matzo cake meal or coconut meal for the almond meal.
Yeah, I have not tried it with coconut meal, although that seems like it would be very successful because I think it has a similar texture. Matzo cake meal, I don't know for sure, but I think that my gut is that it will work because this is really a simple recipe. And again, all the leavening is really coming from the eggs, all the bulk of the cake. So the almond meal, or if you're trying coconut meal or matzo meal, should act just fine. And if you do try it, because again, although I don't want to say with total certainty since I haven't done it myself, but if you do try it, please let us know because it helps, and then we'll let other people know they can substitute it. Okay, so I'm adding the almond. And now I'm going to gently fold this in. And this is the only part that requires any kind of technique, but also don't be scared. You can't really mess it up. The goal is just to not deflate your eggs as much as possible. So I go through the center and then I wrap around. I'll go through the center and I wrap around. And this is sort of starting to gently incorporate this. And you can see I'm just going through the center of the batter. And I'm just going to do this until it's just incorporated. And again, don't get nervous. It's going to turn out okay. If it deflates a little, it's going to turn out okay. It's really important with baking, I feel like, not to get scared. I think there's a lot of fear around like things can go so wrong. And I really think actually baking is much more forgiving than we all give it credit for. This is just like, if you can absolutely do the best technique, great. And if you can't, then mix it up until it's mixed up and you'll be fine. Okay. So that's pretty, I mean, you want to make sure there's no big lumps. I'm looking for that now. I'm doing this obviously at an awkward angle so you can see, but I'm going to set it down and take a little look. Okay, everything seems pretty smooth. Again, I'm sorry about the lighting, but no big clumps, no big bumps. That's good. And at this point, what I'm going to do is add in my fruit. And one step I like to do with this, and one step I didn't mention in the batter, but that is in your list of ingredients, is I add a little potato starch, and the potato starch adds a lightness to the cake. So whether you're using coconut meal or matzo meal, or as recommended, the almond flour, the potato starch helps. And then I'm going to take a little more potato starch. If you have, I mean, I don't eat corn during Pesach, but if you have cornstarch another time of year, or you eat it at Pesach, you can absolutely use that. And then I take my fruit, in this case, strawberries, and I've cut them up almost to like big blueberry size. So I don't want huge strawberries because they can be kind of watery. So with all my berries, I'm just looking, you know, for raspberry, blueberry, like a large size. And I'm going to take the potato starch and I'm going to add it to the strawberries. And I'm just going to toss the strawberries in that starch. And this is going to help with the berries not sinking straight to the bottom of the cake. So I'm going to do that. I also set aside a little bit of extra berries. I'm going to add that now, but I set that aside to remind myself that I want to add a few bit of my berries to the top of the cake. Again, just so they're visible when it's baked. They'll sink a bit, and that's okay, but this is just to make sure they don't all fall to the total bottom of the cake. All right, so now I'm just going to add those coated strawberries to my batter. And then I'm going to just very quickly mix until they're just more or less evenly incorporated, as you can see. I did that very quickly. You don't need to do it very much. And then I'm going to put it in a lined and greased cake tin. You can use a 9-inch square or round. I've used a springform pan for this as well. I do like to line both with parchment, and I used just oil actually to grease this. You can use margarine, you can use spray, whatever, or butter, whatever you're okay with if you're eating dairy. So then I'm going to gently put this into the pan. And then, again, I'm trying not to like be too aggressive with the batter. Let me set that down. Okay, and I'll just let it move a bit. I do want to say though, the 9-inch thing is relatively important. When you change the size of your baking dish, it doesn't always work out with baking. This is where baking is fussy. If you're using too small of a baking dish, then it can overflow, it can sink. And I would just say if you really don't have a 9-inch baking dish and you only have 8-inch baking dishes, then use less batter. You just fill your dish halfway. That would be you don't want it more than halfway. Okay, and are there any questions, Becky, at this point?
A few people wanted to just confirm that almond flour and almond flour meal are the same thing and both okay.
Yes, almond flour, you'll see it says like super fine. I'm trying to see if I have the bag near me. Super fine almond flour, super fine almond meal, anything that's finely ground almonds, even if you make it your own, will work. All right, so then I just topped the little strawberries, my remaining fruit that I set aside on the top. They were also coated in potato starch. And the last touch, and you don't need to do this, this is totally optional, is I like to sprinkle a little bit of raw sugar, also called turbinado sugar. And I sprinkle that on top. I find it makes it a little shiny, a little crunchy on top. It gives it that texture. This cake you can make the day ahead. It will soften as it sits, but you can absolutely make this the day ahead or even 2 days ahead. Again, like I said, the texture changes slightly, but it's absolutely edible. In fact, some people enjoy it with a slightly softer texture. So I just sprinkled on that, and I'm going to put it in a 350 oven. Okay, and then I will just set our timer so we can all take a look at it when it's done. So it's going to bake for 30 to 35 minutes. Again, you know, not every oven runs exactly correctly. Not every oven is the same. So definitely, like, if you know your oven, check it when you feel like if it tends to run fast, then check it a little sooner. But I would say don't check it until at least 25 minutes into the baking process. When you open the oven while the cake is baking, you run the risk of letting your cake deflate. And this is true of pretty much all baking. You want to avoid opening the oven as much as possible.
Sonia, a couple more questions.
Sure.
Can you use the same recipe for muffins?
Oh, what a great question. I think it should work fine too. Yes, absolutely. It's a very simple like snacking cake. So I think it works in all kinds of containers. I think it will even work in like 2 small loaf pans if you don't have a 9-inch. Again, just try not to overfill your pans.
Are the strawberries frozen?
My strawberries were fresh, and I find it works totally well with frozen blueberries, frozen raspberries, frozen blackberries. I avoid frozen strawberries for this just because they tend to be much wetter, but I don't think that means it won't entirely work. But for this, I prefer fresh strawberries, but in general, you can use frozen berries. You could use a mix of berries too.
And is it okay to freeze this cake and defrost it and use it later?
Yes, I have done that. It tends to quite soften the texture, meaning it like really becomes soft. Completely edible, tastes delicious, but just know it like it's a very soft cake. It's kind of hard to cut into neat slices if you freeze and defrost. I also love this cake served with coconut whipped cream or any kind of like whipped topping that you enjoy, whether it's dairy or non-dairy. It's really nice with that, or a sprinkle of powdered sugar if you didn't put the other sugar on. So are there any other remaining cake questions? Otherwise, we'll move on to the next course?
Somebody wants to know, can you use frozen mango?
What a great question. I think frozen mango, again, I would want to cut it really small as it's quite watery. So you're wanting to avoid like super watery fruit, but a fresh mango would certainly, I think, be delicious. I hope you try that, whoever asked that question, because I'd love to know. Please let me know if that works. Such a great idea. Okay, are those the cake questions?
One more.
Sure.
A few people cannot eat eggs and are wondering if there's a substitute. Another participant in the class recommended substituting applesauce. I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah. You know, I've done a lot of vegan baking. Certain recipes, eggs are just really tricky to swap. Again, to the person who suggested applesauce is often a great swap. I would just say for this cake, the eggs are really critical. So I'm really sorry about that to those who don't eat eggs. But I would then look online for a vegan grain-free berry snacking cake. That's what I would look up, because that would be the most similar. So yeah, I only want to tell you if I know for sure. All right, let's move on to soup. The thing about soup is it's so personal. So I really want to start this by saying, please honor your bubby, your Zadie, your family, whatever you love to do. This is just all suggestions. But I found over the years that I've had many vegetarians at my Seders, and it really pains me that they might have to miss the matzo ball soup course. So I really wanted over time to have a great vegetarian matzo ball soup, but that tasted reminiscent of all the comforting flavors of a chicken soup. And we're going to talk about how you do that, because it's more than just the ingredients. There's some technique involved. I'm just going to get my ingredients out. So bear with me for 1 second. Again, this recipe has been on the Nosher. It is not mine, but I will share with you. It's similar to the soup I make, and I will share some of the twists I do on this recipe, but the recipe is perfectly wonderful as written. So if you want to follow something to the T, the recipe on the Nosher is perfect. I believe it's linked by Becky. And just one last thing, and we'll get started. When you're cooking, and this soup is also vegan, matzo balls involve eggs, and we'll talk about matzo balls in a little bit. But the soup itself is actually vegan and vegetarian. And so when you're doing something that's entirely plant-based and you wanted it to feel like nourishing and meaty and very rich in flavor, because often I think there's that concern that it's going to be bland without, you know, the flavor of chicken or beef or things that have a lot of natural flavor. So we're looking to replace that. In this recipe, there's two things that do that for you, and they both contain umami, which is actually a thing, and it's essentially best translated into savoriness. Like, where do you get that like feeling in your mouth that's so savory? It's like Parmesan cheese and all those things. Well, it comes from tomato paste, which is naturally full of umami, and mushrooms, which is sort of like the definition of umami. So what we're going to do is actually get the most out of these flavors. One moment, I'm just going to heat this. So I have my soup pot out. I'm going to add a little olive oil. You can add absolutely any oil that you use. A couple tablespoons. And you want to be generous with it because, again, you're not using any animal fat. So having a little extra oil is going to be important here. And while that's heating up, I'm going to talk a little about the mushrooms that we're going to saute. So these are shiitake. I really recommend these. If I can't find them fresh, I'll often make vegetarian broths with dried shiitake. The other thing I do is the recipe suggests that you wash them, which absolutely, if that's your custom or preference, do that. I tend to not like to wash my mushrooms because, not because I don't like things clean, I very much do, but because they are sponges and they get very soggy and then they don't brown or saute as well, and their texture changes. So what I do is I get a damp rag or paper towel, and you can even get a mushroom brush. I have one of those as well. And I really wipe it off. Also, remember, we're not eating these raw, we're cooking them. So a tiny bit of dirt in a pot that simmers for an hour will not hurt anyone. But again, I don't like things dirty and I don't like grit. So I'm going to do a really good job underneath the mushroom, on top of the mushroom. And if you don't have the patience for that, then just wash them and it's okay. Your texture will just be a little different. I take off the woody stems. And what I always do with my mushroom stems is I save them, not for this recipe, but for future recipes, I put these in the freezer in whatever container you like to freeze things in, along with other scraps I might have. And I save those until I get a big pile, and then I'll make vegetarian broths or even add them to chicken broth. So I love keeping the stems. They're full of flavor for broths, not so pleasant to eat. And then what we're going to do is just slice the shiitake. You don't have to slice this in any fancy way. We're just doing sort of 1/4-inch slices. And I have a fair amount. This is like 16 or 17. So you can see it's like kind of a big bowl full. But before we add the mushrooms to the pot, we're actually going to start by adding our tomato paste. I have 4 tablespoons here. I'm going to let that start sizzling on there. Normally, I would do this over like a medium-high heat so nothing burns. We're going to move this along a little at a higher heat to speed things along. The thing about tomato paste is, and this, I love this about this recipe, is that when you cook it in oil, it caramelizes. It becomes richer in flavor and sweeter. And therefore, like a lot of times you'll see like adding tomato paste at the end before you add your liquid. But I always add tomato paste after I saute my vegetables. I typically add tomato paste to them. And I always cook my tomato paste a little bit before I add liquid for exactly this reason. It's going to add so much depth. Like if you have a spaghetti sauce, any tomato soup, anything you're doing with tomatoes, this is like a crucial step. So this doesn't need terribly long. You can kind of hear in the background, we're gonna let the tomato paste start to get like a little richer in color, take the tinniness out, and then we're gonna add the mushrooms to it. And I feel like there's some questions happening. Is that right?
There's a question about tomato paste. Do you use it from a can or more concentrated in a tube?
I love both can and tube. Today I had a can, so I used that. I also have a tip for my canned tomato. I mean, I love the tube because you can stick it back in the fridge and it lasts forever and you don't have to worry about waste. But what I started doing with my leftover tomato paste, like even today, is I put this in a Ziploc bag and I freeze it just like this. You could use a stasher bag or some other container if you don't want to waste. Hold on 1 second. We'll add I don't want this to burn. So I'm adding my mushrooms to my tomato paste and oil. 1 moment. And a little color is no problem. It's just going to add flavor. So I'm not concerned about that. I just don't want it to get blackened. But okay, yeah, I freeze it just like this. And actually it kind of like breaks off. So you can even like break off a piece of it. Or sometimes I'll freeze my tomato cans into a couple bags, so I have just enough for like a thing of pasta sauce. It's really helpful for me. But yeah, I love the tubes. They're excellent. I just think finding one that tastes good to you, like I like to find a good tomato paste. These things make a difference. Like when you only need a little of something, I like it to invest in it being a little better. Okay.
What about, Sonia, do you use seaweed for some extra umami? Somebody wants.
Yes, that's such a wonderful question. I do use seaweed. I love to use kelp in particular. It's a thicker seaweed. It's often used in, well, it's one of the main ingredients in dashi, Japanese broth, like the mother broth of Japanese cooking. That absolutely adds umami. But because it's not always in everyone's pantry, this recipe, I think if you have it, add it, and it will work beautifully in this recipe, and it won't taste fishy. It adds a umami richness. So in fact, like anchovies, I mean, that's not vegan or vegetarian, also do umami and add flavor, but you don't taste the fish when they're added to sauces and things. Okay, so we've just added our mushrooms, and we've let those cook for just a few minutes just to start to get them coated in the oil and in the tomato paste. And now at this point, I'm going to add my water. I'm going to add a little in a moment, but it says about 10 cups. I feel like add as much water as you feel it needs. Just know that if you add a lot of water, it's going to dilute the flavor. So you could start out with, the recommended, and then just add a little more if you need it. So this recipe is interesting in that it differs a little bit from mine, in that the recipe developers have you wrap up your vegetables in cheesecloth and then put them into the tomato and mushroom mixture. And I think that's a very smart way to do it and a very time sensitive way to do it, because you can throw everything into cheesecloth, which we'll do in a second. And then you can just fish it out. And then you don't have to strain your broth. You don't have to do anything, because the truth is, when you simmer a broth, and we're not starting with pre-made broth, we're starting with water, all the vegetables lose their flavor anyway. So what I tend to do, if you don't have cheesecloth and you don't want to go get cheesecloth and you don't want to do this, what I tend to do is to just actually chop up all my vegetables in big chunks, just like I'm about to for the cheesecloth. And then I strain my broth. And then before serving my soup, I'll add fresh carrots and fresh celery only, and fresh herbs at just like 15 minutes before, like while I'm heating up the soup, just until they're just tender. I'll slice them very small and thin. So I hope that makes sense. This method has you putting it in cheesecloth, which we're about to do, we'll circle back to, and then you're going to fish out the cheesecloth, and then you just have this broth with the mushrooms in it, and that's it, no other vegetables. And with my method, you skip the cheesecloth, you strain your broth, which includes your mushrooms, and then you add sliced carrot and sliced celery to the broth afterwards when you're ready to serve it. Okay, so the great thing about recipes like this, like any broth, is you don't have to do fine cuts. So if you hate chopping, this takes 2 seconds. You can even just chop them in half if you really hate chopping. I've washed all of these vegetables already. I have 3 carrots. I'm also not going to chop them super fine. I do want to say, though, that when I serve carrots in my soup, like I described to you, when I add them for serving, I prefer to peel them, because I find there's a little bitterness in the peels. But when I'm making a broth, I don't peel them. And that's just like a personal preference. Some chefs really believe that you don't ever need to peel your carrots. Some do. So, like, again, do you. The other addition that I like to add to this particular soup that's a little different from the recipe is I love to add rutabaga to my vegetable broths. I think it's a very underrated root vegetable. It's extremely sweet. It's not as earthy or dirt tasting as beets. It's not bitter. It doesn't have that funny flavor turnips have. And I find it just adds one more layer of flavor to a vegetable broth. So again, I'm just going to cut it into quarters. I'm not going to do any fancy cutting. But you could absolutely make a soup where this is cubed small and bite-sized pieces, and people might even think it's potato. It's really a wonderful vegetable. I have parsnip that's already pre-cut. I also have the other ingredient that I personally like to add to my vegetable broths is sweet potatoes. And that might be a little counterintuitive. They don't fall apart. They hold their shape. I keep them in large chunks, and they add a sort of golden sweetness to the broth that I personally really enjoy. If you don't like that, skip it. This recipe has us adding red onion and yellow onion. I would say if you don't want to add both, just add yellow. If you don't want to, because too much red onion, I think it will darken your soup too much. And we're going to put all of this in cheesecloth right now, in addition to some herbs and some garlic. So hold on, there's a lot of ingredients about to happen. The thing with the garlic too, the peels can stay on your onions, they can stay on your garlic. Remember, you're fishing this all out, whether you're straining it or whether you're putting it in cheesecloth. And the peels aren't going to do anything harmful. And I've washed these ahead of time. So I've just cut this garlic down the center. And I love doing this because it's really going to expose all those cloves. It's going to give us all that beautiful garlic flavor. If you don't like garlic or you don't like any of the ingredients I mentioned, then just skip those and add what you like. And then there's a few herbs that I like to add that's also not in the recipe. So the recipe calls for a bunch of dill and a bunch of parsley, which I have here. It's already been washed. It's ready to go. I define, like, people think bay doesn't have flavor, and I disagree. I think bay has tremendous flavor. If you stick a bay leaf in water and boil it, you will identify the flavor of bay. So I will not make a chicken soup or a vegetarian soup without it. I also find that thyme in vegetarian soups, fresh thyme, is a very helpful ingredient. It adds that thing of like, what's in this? Like, it's sort of lemony. It's sort of earthy, piney, floral, but all of that's so subtle when it cooks, and it really adds a dimension to a broth that makes it have taste when it can be bland otherwise. And then I happen to have some green garlic tops. I'm going to throw those in there too. You could have leek tops. You could have scallions. Like if you have other things lying around, this is a perfect time to use them. Okay, so we're gonna put this in our cheesecloth. I do not have cheesecloth bags, so that is much more convenient if you happen to have it. I just have a couple sheets of cheesecloth. And then I'm going to tie this up, and I have some string, twine, like food safe twine. And I have 2 pieces of cheesecloth because obviously there's a lot of vegetables happening here. So thank you for bearing with me while I try to figure this out. Cheesecloth is also kind of a pain to cut. So again, if you can find the bags, that's very convenient. Okay. So I'm just going to tie that up, and then I'm going to plop this into the pot with my mushrooms, my water, my tomato paste that we cooked off. And then I'm going to take the second batch again because I don't have a big bag. And I'm going to add those cut up onions with the skin still on. Again, the purple onion might give us a little bit of a darker color. And the sweet potato, the white onion, the parsnips. Okay, and then, in fact, I might actually stick this out. Those are easy to fish out, so I'm just taking out some things that are easier to fish out so I can add the herbs to this, which is, even if you, well, if you were making a broth to strain, it doesn't matter, but sometimes it's nice to take your herbs and also tie these with twine. And that can be something you fish out later on its own too. So you don't even need cheesecloth if you want to do that. So, and then I'm taking the whole bunch, stems and all. Stems are very, very good in broths. That's another thing I always add to any vegetarian broth I'm making are the stems of dill and parsley or cilantro or any herb that you like. Those are the main 3. And because they have all so much flavor in them, in a way more than their tops. But I'm adding the whole thing here, and I'm reserving some fresh herbs to add at the end, because I think it's really helpful to add fresh herbs at the very end, the tops of the herbs, just before you're serving. That's where so much flavor is. Okay. So now I'm going to add this to the pot. And like I said, my cheesecloth was a little small today, but at home you could, I have more cheesecloth. I could use more cheesecloth. These are all very easy to fish out, so I'm just going to stick them in the pot as well. The onion, the rutabaga, the parsnip, remaining parsnip.
So now a couple questions about cheesecloth.
Yeah.
Can you substitute with a nut milk bag or a soup sock, other options?
Yes, so soup sock will work. I would be concerned to what kind of nut milk bag it is. If it has any plastic or made with any kind of plastic, I'd avoid that. Not all nut milk bags are heat sensitive, but a soup bag, if it's designed for soups, should work just fine. And again, you don't need cheesecloth. So I find it just as simple to, and also if you don't want to strain, like scoop it out with a slotted spoon or use a strainer. Like you don't have to do anything complicated. You can just fish stuff out and compost it or throw it away. So yeah, cheesecloth is not an essential, but I do think it's a great hack if you're looking to simplify but still get all the flavor. And if you don't want to strain and you don't want the mess, it makes it so easy. And I believe that's why the recipe developers wrote it as such. Are there any other questions about the soup? Before I add a few more things, Becky. Okay, the other thing about the soup is I will never let this boil. So I'm going to bring this up to the most gentle simmer, and then I'm just going to let it simmer for a minimum of an hour. If you add a little more water, it will reduce, right? So you can always add more water at the beginning or at the end. If it's reducing too much, just use your intuition on that. But the more you cook it, the more it will reduce. But what happens when it reduces is all that flavor becomes more intense. So I really tend to make my soups and my stocks, I let them simmer for usually a minimum of 2 hours, just because I really want to maximize that flavor. If you're in a rush, then you can do an hour, it will be fine, it will be delicious. You can use an instant pot for this, that would work beautifully. You could use a crock pot and do it that way. You could, again, just do this very quickly, have it be an hour. And if you're really still missing flavor, then there's always the opportunity of bouillon, or, you know, a vegan one or a vegetarian one. I find that these have plenty of flavor without that, but that's always an option. The other ingredient that we did not talk about that goes in this is turmeric. This just happens to be one of my favorite ones. It's the Diaspora Co. I just think the flavor is extraordinary. But the turmeric will add a little golden color. It will also add flavor. It does have a flavor. It's not just for color, and especially if it's a good quality one. So I'm going to add about a teaspoon of that. The recipe calls for half teaspoons. I particularly like turmeric, so I'll add a whole teaspoon. And when you're using any turmeric, it's great to add black pepper. That actually enhances all of the anti-inflammatory properties of turmeric. It's a very healing spice, but it needs black pepper. So it also flavor-wise is good to add pepper to your soup. And I'm also going to add salt. I'm going to start with like a couple, let's say, generous teaspoons, and then I'll add more later when I taste it. You can always add more salt later. It's obviously harder to take away salt. And I'm just going to add a little more liquid before we move on to the other thing. One moment. And Becky, if there's any questions, let me know.
There are a couple questions about mushrooms. Is it necessary to use the mushrooms? Where do you get kosher dried shiitakes? Can you use reconstituted dried shiitakes?
Yes. So I think mushrooms are fairly important when you're making a vegan broth, but if you're allergic or you really hate mushrooms, then absolutely skip them. You know, I just think it's where a lot of your flavor is going to come from. So, and it doesn't taste mushroomy. And shiitakes in particular have tons of flavor in a way that button mushrooms don't. Dried mushrooms mixes I've seen at Trader Joe's, but you have to, you know, if you can't find kosher certified, which can be tricky, I actually dry my own. You can put them in an oven at a low temperature. If I have too many mushrooms so they don't go to waste, I'll do that and store those. But you don't need to have dried mushrooms for this. You can use fresh. There was one other question I think that you asked me. I can't remember the last one.
Somebody was wondering where to get the dried shiitakes, especially a kosher version.
Yeah, like I said, I've seen dry mushroom mixes at Trader Joe's, but they're not always there. So I would look in your produce section. Sometimes, you know, I can't remember which brands are kosher certified off the top of my head. So I would do a little Googling on that. And if you can't find it, then use fresh. Sometimes porcini is easier to source, dried porcini, and those have tremendous flavor. Oh, the reconstituted ones, that was the question. You can absolutely reconstitute them. They'll be a little like chewier. They're not as nice of a texture, but they'll absolutely work. But if you're using, I think it's nice to use reconstituted in a way because you can slice them. If you're using dried, I would put them in the cheesecloth so that it's not something you're eating in the soup. It's just flavoring your soup. And then the last thing, we're not going to go into matzo balls today. This recipe directs you to use a matzo ball mix. I'll just say that I actually think matzo ball mixes are great. Shannon Zarna, who could not be here tonight because unfortunately is under the weather, and we all wish her a refuah shlema very fast. But she and I very much agree on this. The boxed matzo ball mix, not the soup mix, just the matzo balls, makes an incredibly good matzo ball, and the ingredients are just matzo meal and salt and baking powder, baking soda, onion, black pepper, garlic, celery seeds. So there's no weird ingredients in this, which I really appreciate. But what I do if I'm using boxed matzo ball mix is I always add fresh herbs. So if they're not homemade, I love to just add something that makes it taste a little homemade. So to that, I would add chopped fresh dill, chopped fresh parsley, or finely chopped chives or scallions. All of those would work beautifully. And you can just add a couple teaspoons or tablespoons of that to your mix. There's also plenty of matzo ball recipes that you can make from scratch. And then the last point is, I know people want a great vegan matzo ball recipe. I really understand that sentiment. I have yet to try, I've tried many, and I've yet to have one that I can fully endorse. Again, it's just one of those recipes where the eggs are such a critical part of what makes a matzo ball a matzo ball. Having said that, Joe Nathan has one on the New York Times that I think people like. I would just do a little research and see the highest reviewed vegan matzo balls, because like I said, I wish I could tell you, here's my go-to. I don't have that yet. So, but there's other alternatives to matzo balls that you could serve. And you also could just add more vegetables. So again, instead of fishing out all your vegetables, you could make a soup with vegetables. So that at least there's that feeling of a nourishing soup at your Seder. Okay, and then we're going to move on to the main dish of the evening, which is, and I'm just going to keep an eye on the cake. We have a couple minutes left on that. The last thing I want to share with you tonight is eggplant shawarma. So I love a vegetarian or plant-based main. This is totally plant-based. It's not even just vegetarian, it's vegan. That has tons of flavor, is extremely satisfying and filling and rich, but without a lot of weird ingredients. I tend to not like to have like crazy substitutions. And at Pesach, of course, like many people don't eat tofu or legumes. So this is why I've chosen this as my vegetarian main. And I'll give you a few tips on what makes this sort of meaty and what helps your eggplant get a wonderful texture and a wonderful flavor. And we'll start with a homemade shawarma blend. If you don't want to make your own blend, then there are many, many shawarma blends available on the market that are kosher, that are delicious. Use that. And the recipe will tell you exactly how much to use. But I also have included the ingredients for a homemade blend, and this blend will be totally used in this recipe, so you won't have leftover. But if you do have leftover, it will keep for, 3 to 6 months quite well. So let me get a measuring spoon. In here already, I have paprika, smoked paprika, and a little bit of chili pepper. You can use cayenne, you could use Urfa pepper, you can use chili flake, or you can omit chili at all. I suggest keeping the smoked paprika. It's going to give a sort of charred meatiness to the eggplant that's really nice. So that I don't recommend skipping unless you hate the taste, then skip it. And again, do what you like. This is not about me being the authority on this. And so then 2 are paprika, and the regular paprika doesn't have tremendous flavor. It's a little, tastes like a bell pepper in a way, dehydrated, which I believe is what it's mostly made out of. And it adds a nice, beautiful color to the final dish. So I'm adding coriander, which is the seed of cilantro, and it just smells so nice. I think this is an important ingredient. So 1.5 teaspoons of that. And then cumin, which also is going to add that sort of earthy smokiness. These are all traditional ingredients in every shawarma blend. Like they all differ slightly. Some have a little less cumin or a little more coriander, a little more pepper, or a little more of this or that. So this is just to my liking. But again, these are sort of the basic components. And before we finish the blend, I'm just going to check on our cake. I can tell by looking at it that it's perfectly done. It's been 30 minutes. It's golden. It's risen beautifully to the top. It was halfway when I put it in, and now you can see that the strawberries have sunk. They're not totally at the top, but they're still visible, especially the ones we kept on the top of the cake. So this can just cool. And yeah, that's fine. I'm just moving this over. And like I said, once that cools, I can just cover it. I can serve it tomorrow. I can serve it a few days from now. I can freeze it. It will change the texture, but it will still be delicious. So it doesn't go to waste and it can be made ahead. Okay, so we've had our coriander, cumin, paprika, smoked paprika. I'm going to add garlic powder and then turmeric. The exact measurements are listed. I'm just going to eyeball this. And then I think this is a very important ingredient. I like to add allspice. It gives this shawarma taste. Some people add allspice, some people add a little clove. Allspice is a ground, it has like a ground, like round sort of bead seed. You can find this readily available in any spice section. And if you don't have it, you could certainly add like a pinch of clove or a little bit of nutmeg, or you just skip it entirely. But I do really happen to be partial to that. And then the other thing that is optional that I don't have right in front of me, one moment, is brown sugar. Oh, again, if you don't eat sugar, just skip this. But I find the brown sugar, just a teaspoon of it, creates a caramelized topping to the eggplant. It just gives it that extra tiny bit of sweetness, depth, and a little bit of that color on top. If you don't like sugar, skip it. You could use coconut sugar or another sugar if you want. And then I'm just going to mix this all together and set this aside. So for our eggplant, I try to find ones that are roughly the same size. I believe the recipe has a weight. Yeah, so roughly like just under a pound each, pretty big. I serve typically like a half per person, or a quarter depending on who's dining. So you can count it that way. This recipe can be doubled or tripled as needed. And then I cut it down lengthwise into 2 equal halves. The other thing is you can definitely make this in advance and the same day. It's trickier to make it the day ahead, but you absolutely can make it a day ahead. It reheats very beautifully, especially when it's made the same day. Or you can just serve it immediately warm. But so then I'm going to take my paring knife, a small knife, and I'm going to do crisscross slits. I'll come closer to you so you can see. So what I'm doing is I'm going almost to the bottom. If you can see, my knife is going like this, and I'm doing these in this direction, and then I'm going to switch directions and crisscross in the other direction. This is again going to help with the overall texture and flavor of your eggplant. It's going to absorb the oil better. It's going to absorb the spices better. Typically, what I would do at this point is salt it and let it sit for 30 minutes or something before I did anything else. So maybe I preheat my oven then, and just let the salt get really like soaked into the eggplant. And then I might dab it, dry it off a little. Okay, that's like the fussy way to do it. A lot of times you just don't have time. So if you don't have time, don't do it that way. And earlier today, I didn't have time, so I didn't let it sit with salt, and I know it will still be delicious. It's just like an extra, like it makes it like a hint better, like slightly better. If you're frying eggplant, salting it ahead of time does make a difference because it lets the moisture come out of the eggplant first. And then, so again, I'm just salting it enough that it really is a generous amount, but not crazy, because we're not like taking the salt off. And then what we're going to do before we spice it is we're going to brush these with oil. And I give you the exact amount for 3 whole eggplants or 6 halves, which is a 1/4 cup of oil. Because this is a plant-based main entree, you really want a lot of oil. This is not a time to skimp. I use olive oil, but absolutely you can use any oil that you like. Any oil that you can brush on that you use will work for this. I think olive oil gives it a nice flavor. And I just start by like taking a little and brushing it on each half, and then I'll keep going through all the halves back and forth until I've used up all the oil fairly evenly across all 6 halves of eggplant. As you're going to see, it's like going to start to slowly soak it up. It might even look a little patchy, and that's totally fine. And then after I've gotten all the oil into every single half of eggplant, then I'm going to add the spice mixture, and you're going to add a generous amount. You're going to add about 1.5 teaspoons to each eggplant. It's going to seem crazy. And if you don't like things so spicy or so spice forward, like it's not spicy like hot, it's spicy more like flavorful, then certainly you can cut back on this. But I find that the spice as it gets rubbed in and as it bakes, adds its own element of texture. This is 1.5 teaspoons. It's not a wild amount, but it's quite thick, and it's really getting into each of these little nooks and crannies. I have one that's partially baked that I'm going to show you what happens as it bakes. So then we add the spice mix to each one. And then I put it in the oven. And at some point during the cooking time, so this, I'm going to show you one that's about 3/4 cooked. So it's not fully, you want this fully tender. So what you can see is like, it's like falling apart. And each of these little tops has its own crust of spice. Again, it gives it a little bit more texture than just like a soft eggplant, which is what I like. But what I do during the cooking process is I drizzle even more oil onto my eggplant. So I like to have a squeeze bottle, but you could use a brush, and I'll literally just drizzle generously. Maybe like it's a crazy amount of oil. Eggplants take a lot of oil. And then I'll put it back in the oven and let it bake all the way through, like I'm going to right now. And then at the very end, right before serving, I'm going to drizzle it with oil once again. It's because it will look like even a little dry. It will need that oil. And it depends on the cooking time, like on your eggplant. Different eggplants have different water content, different weight. So really you're looking for total tenderness, like you can stick a skewer in each part and there's no resistance. It can almost be falling apart. That's when you know it's done. And it can be reheated even when it's almost falling apart. Like I said, it reheats quite nicely. The other thing I do is once my eggplant is ready to be served, whether I've reheated it or made it fresh, it also actually tastes wonderful at room temperature. It doesn't have to be piping hot. So the various toppings work really well. I've recommended zhug, which is a Yemenite hot sauce of peppers like jalapeno or serrano, cilantro, and parsley with cardamom. It's very easy to make in a blender or a food processor, or even by hand if you like chopping things very fine. And I love that with this dish because you have this smoky, spice-forward, shawarma-rich, oil-rich eggplant. And then you have this bright green sauce that's lemony and herbaceous, and it's on top. But depending on your own customs for Pesach, like I said, everyone has their own customs. If you do eat seeds or nuts or legumes, I mean, not nuts, sorry, legumes, other things that are beautiful on top of this are a roasted chickpea or even a fresh chickpea, a drizzle of tahini. When it's not Pesach, often I'll do a tahini drizzle and a pomegranate molasses drizzle on something like this, and then top it with more fresh herbs at the end, like a sprinkling of parsley or cilantro. And it just is so beautiful. And again, for your vegetarian guests or for people who want maybe just a slightly lighter entree, it is still festive and special. And I think that's the point when you're hosting and making vegetarian meals, is that whether you're creating a side or a dish for the guests who don't eat meat, or whether the entire meal is vegetarian or vegan, to have these things that don't feel like just an afterthought or a replacement, but can stand alone in their own right. And I really think it works well with this. And then just the last note about the eggplant dish is it works beautifully with cauliflower. If you are a person, if your community eats cauliflower and you eat cauliflower, it works really well to cut cauliflower steaks. You could use the same rub, you can use lots of oil, you can flip them through halfway, and that's another great way to do it. And Becky, are there any questions?
A few questions. Somebody noticed maybe a missing word in the recipe where it said eggplant can be swapped out for a thick cut of blank.
We'll let the team know that a word got lost, and that would have been cauliflower. Sometimes it happens when they make edits. So I'm sorry for that. But thank you for letting us know. Cauliflower will work. Zucchini would also work. I would just make sure it's, again, cut quite thick, like take a big zucchini and cut it in half. That would work beautifully. And you could even, if you know the Thomas Keller zucchini method, look it up. It's really great. It became kind of TikTok viral. That method would work really well with these spices.
Some other people wanted to confirm if you were sprinkling the eggplant with kosher salt versus regular salt.
Yeah, it actually doesn't matter. I was using kosher salt and I like a coarse salt, but you can use any salt.
That's it.
That's it. And a nice sprinkle of salt at the end. Like I love to have a sea salt or a flake salt, like a little bit of, like the fun with these things is garnishing. Like it's not just enough. You have your eggplant, it's done, it's great, but there's that extra step of just the drizzle of oil, the squeeze of lemon, the shower of herbs, the sprinkle of salt. All those things will make a huge difference and people will notice. And they're just the very small touches. But yeah, there's also a lot of other vegetarian suggestions on the Nosher. There's plenty of other, if eggplant's not your thing or cauliflower is not your thing, I highly recommend taking a peek at what they have to offer. You can also find a lot of recipes on my site, sonyasanford.com. I love hearing from people, so feel free to reach out to me. I will always answer your questions as quickly as I can. Check your spam if you don't hear back from me. And yeah, I offer classes privately and for groups and for companies and nonprofits and organizations. So always feel free to reach out. I'm so happy to be able to spend this evening with you. What's zhug? Zhug is a Yemenite herb sauce. There's a link to the recipe for zhug. It's Michael Solomonov's recipe. He owns a restaurant called Zahav in Philadelphia. He's an acclaimed chef. But it's a very traditional Yemenite sauce. And it's just cilantro, parsley, garlic, hot chili peppers like jalapeno or serrano, and cardamom. Typically, those are the ingredients with lemon and oil. And you blitz it all together in a blender or food processor, and it stores for at least a week in your fridge. And it's just a beautiful condiment to have on your table. And I love it on this particular dish. And this zhug recipe is linked within the article for this recipe, or you can also just look it up on the Nosher. It's spelled ZHUG.
We just linked to it in the chat.
Thank you so much. Yeah. So it's just a delicious, it's always that thing that people go, oh my God, what is this? And it took you like 5 minutes to make, and it's just delicious on everything, on meat as well, if you're a meat eater. So Chag Sameach, everyone. May it be a healthy and happy Pesach. Thank you so much again for coming tonight. And yeah, I love hearing from you. So reach out anytime.
Thank you so much, Sonya, and thank you to all of you who joined. We really appreciate you finding the right link and joining us even after our technical snafus. So thank you for bearing with us. We're so grateful to Sonya for teaching us these 3 dishes. And we have another class coming up. So if you're on the list, you'll get notified about that. And everybody wants to know always if we're sending around the recording, and the answer is yes, we will send around the recording for this. Thank you all so much, and Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach. Bye.